Chapter 1 Stephen Grant A Life That Was Never. Stephen Grant wakes up every morning already tired, not because he has lived too much, but because his life requires constant vigilance against something he cannot see, name, or fully understand. And from the very beginning of Moon Knight, it is clear that Stephen's exhaustion is not physical, but existential. He lives inside a routine so rigid it feels ceremonial, as if repeating the same gestures every day might somehow keep reality stable. He wakes up in the same bed, in the same small London apartment, carefully placing sand around the door and chaining himself to the bed, not as a quirky habit, but as a quiet act of fear management. Stephen does not know what he is afraid of. He only knows that when he sleeps, something happens, and when he wakes, time is missing. His life is built not on memory, but on gaps. He works at the museum gift shop, surrounded by artifacts from ancient civilizations, relics of gods, death, and judgment, and yet he himself feels unreal, as though he is an exhibit mislabeled, placed in the wrong room. Stephen talks too much, apologizes too often, smiles when no one is looking, and avoids confrontation not because he is weak, but because his entire existence depends on keeping the world calm enough that it does not push back. There is something deeply lonely about the way he exists, not alone in a room, but alone inside his own body. Stephen believes he is unremarkable. That belief is not humility, it is survival. He has learned, subconsciously, that drawing attention leads to consequences he cannot explain. His British accent, soft and polite, is a shield. His awkwardness is camouflage. Every interaction is carefully modulated to remain harmless, forgettable, safe, and yet the cracks are already there. He wakes up holding objects he does not recognize, his body sore from actions he cannot remember performing. He loses days. He misses dates that he was certain he had written down. The world around him treats these lapses as carelessness, but the truth is far more unsettling. Stephen Grant is not failing at life. He is sharing it. The museum, where he spends his days explaining Egyptian mythology to indifferent tourists, becomes an ironic sanctuary. Stephen knows everything about gods, rituals, and the weighing of the heart, yet he has no understanding of his own inner world. He speaks passionately about Amit, about judgment before wrongdoing, about the Duat and the afterlife, as if narrating someone else's beliefs, unaware that these stories are not academic for him, but personal. There is a strange poetry in this. Stephen teaches others about gods who possess, punish, and resurrect, while being possessed himself without consent or comprehension. His fascination with ancient Egypt is not coincidental. It is memory trying to surface, trauma circling itself until it finds language. Stephen's apartment is a place of containment, not comfort. The sand around the door is not there to keep intruders out, but to keep Stephen informed, to tell him if something leaves. The restraints on his bed are not for protection from the outside world, but from himself. These are not the actions of a man who believes he is safe. They are the rituals of someone living with unspoken terror. Stephen does not remember choosing these precautions. They simply exist, like instincts inherited from a past he cannot access. And every morning he checks the sand, the chains, the locks, hoping the night stayed quiet. Sometimes it did not. There is a constant undertone of guilt in Stephen's life, though he cannot articulate why. He feels responsible for things that have not happened to him, arguments he does not remember, injuries he cannot explain, apologies he offers reflexively. Guilt without memory is one of the most destabilizing emotions a mind can produce, because it cannot be resolved. Stephen's mind compensates by shrinking his world. He avoids relationships. He lives alone. He eats the same meals. He speaks to a goldfish, Gus, not because he prefers animals, but because Gus will not challenge his narrative of continuity. When Gus appears with extra fins one day, even that fragile anchor is compromised. The smallest inconsistency becomes terrifying, because if even the fish is not the same, then perhaps Stephen is not either. When Stephen begins to experience full blackouts, moments where reality shifts mid-conversation, where his reflection speaks back to him, where his body moves without his permission, the series makes a deliberate choice. It does not rush. These moments are not framed as action beats, but as disorientation. The audience shares Stephen's confusion. We do not see what happens when Stephen disappears. We only see the aftermath. This narrative absence is crucial because it mirrors dissociation itself. Stephen's life is not about what happens. It is about what he misses. The horror is not violence. It is lost time. Stephen Grant is not a false identity in the traditional sense. He is not a lie created to deceive others. He is a refuge. Somewhere in Stephen's past, a mind fractured to protect itself, and Stephen is the part that stayed gentle so the rest could endure. His politeness, his restraint, his avoidance of conflict, these are not weaknesses. They are adaptations. Stephen exists so someone else does not have to feel pain all the time. He carries ignorance so another part can carry memory. In this way, Stephen's life is an act of sacrifice performed daily without recognition. The presence of Khonshu begins as a whisper, then a demand. Stephen hears voices, sees reflections that move independently, senses judgment lurking just outside his peripheral vision. But even here, Stephen resists confrontation. He does not immediately question his reality. Instead, he tries to normalize it, to rationalize it away. This is perhaps the most human reaction of all. When the mind fractures, it does not announce itself, it hides, hoping the world will remain manageable. Stephen's refusal to accept what is happening is not denial. It is fear that if he looks too closely, he will disappear. What makes Stephen Grant's story so quietly devastating is that he is kind. Not performatively kind, not heroically kind, but genuinely, persistently kind. He listens, he explains, he tries, and yet the world rarely rewards him for it. His co-workers mock him, his manager dismisses him, his loneliness is invisible. Stephen exists in a society that values confidence, assertiveness, and control, and he has none of those things because they were never safe options for him. His kindness is not a personality trait, it is a coping mechanism refined into identity. By the end of this chapter of his life, Stephen stands at the edge of a truth he cannot yet name. His life is not wrong, it is incomplete. The days he loses are not accidents. They are someone else's survival, and the most tragic element of Stephen Grant's existence is not that he is unaware of who he truly is, but that he believes his life is all there is. Small, limited, apologetic, when in reality he is part of something much larger, much darker, and much more painful. Stephen Grant lives a life that was never meant to be whole, because wholeness would have destroyed him, and for now, survival is enough. Chapter 2: Marc Spector, the man who didn't survive the desert. Marc Spector's story does not begin with heroism or gods or violence, but with absence. The absence of safety, of consistency, of a childhood that could have unfolded without fear. Because Marc was shaped long before the desert ever claimed him, long before Khonshu ever spoke his name. As a child, Marc learned a brutal lesson early. Pain does not always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from love, twisted by grief. His brother's death was not just a tragedy. It was a fracture point, a moment when the world split into before and after. Marc survived, and survival became guilt. His mother's sorrow curdled into blame, and Marc's home became a place where affection was conditional and punishment felt inevitable. In that environment, Marc learned to disappear inside himself, to split awareness away from pain, to create distance where none physically existed. The mind did what the body could not. It escaped. This is where Mark truly begins, not as a soldier, not as a mercenary, but as a boy who learned that endurance sometimes requires fragmentation. As Mark grew, control became his obsession. He sought it in structure, in discipline, in physical capability. The military offered rules, hierarchy, and a promise that if you followed orders, the world would make sense. Mark became competent, reliable, lethal, not because he loved violence, but because violence was predictable. It obeyed rules. It did not surprise you the way grief did. Yet even within the military, Mark carried instability with him like a shadow. The fractures in his mind did not disappear. They were simply managed, buried beneath procedure and adrenaline. When that life collapsed, through betrayal, moral compromise, or simple exhaustion, Mark drifted into mercenary work, a profession that offered one thing he believed he deserved: punishment. Each job pushed him further from the person he once might have been, further into a version of himself that could absorb damage without complaint. The desert, then, is not a random setting for Mark's death. It is inevitability made physical, endless, silent, indifferent. Mark is betrayed by those he trusted, shot, and left bleeding beneath an unforgiving sun. There is no hero stand here, no final speech. Just sand filling his mouth, heat pressing down, consciousness slipping away. Mark dies there, not metaphorically, not spiritually. He dies. The man who carried guilt like a burden finally collapses under its weight. And in that moment, when breath fades, when the body fails, something ancient takes notice. Khonshu does not save Mark out of kindness. He chooses him because Mark is already broken in the precise way a god of vengeance requires. Khonshu offers Mark a bargain, but it is not a negotiation between equals. It is an ultimatum delivered to a dying mind. Live, but never be free. Mark accepts, not because he wants power, but because some part of him still believes survival is an obligation, not a gift. When Mark wakes, resurrected, the world is sharper, louder, heavier. The desert does not disappear. It lives inside him now, a reminder that death is not an end, but a boundary he crossed and returned from changed. Mark's relationship with violence shifts after his resurrection. Before, it was transactional, a job, a means of control. After Khonshu, violence becomes ritual, purposeful, directed. Mark becomes Moon Knight, not as a hero, but as an instrument. He does not mete out justice because he believes in it. He does so because disobedience brings consequences far worse than physical pain. Khonshu's voice is constant, invasive, authoritative. A god who sees Mark not as a man, but as a vessel, and Mark, already fractured, already conditioned to endure abuse, complies. The suit does not make him powerful, it makes him owned. Mark's greatest tragedy is not what he does under Khonshu's command, but what it costs him in the spaces between missions. His relationship with Layla begins in honesty and shared passion, but erodes under secrets Mark believes he must keep to protect her. He hides not because he is cruel, but because he does not trust himself to remain stable. Love, to Mark, is dangerous. It creates leverage. It gives the world something to take. And so he distances himself, not realizing that absence can wound just as deeply as truth. Mark's life becomes compartmentalized: soldier, husband, avatar, ghost, each role incompatible with the others. Unlike Stephen, who exists to soften the world, Mark exists to absorb it. He takes pain so others do not have to, a pattern established in childhood and perfected in adulthood. When Stephen Grant surfaces more fully, Mark initially views him as a liability, a mistake, a weakness. But slowly, painfully, Mark begins to understand the truth. Stephen exists because Mark could not survive alone. Stephen is not an intruder. He is a lifeline. Mark did not create Stephen to escape responsibility. He created him to preserve something gentle, something unbroken, something that could still believe the world was worth explaining rather than fighting. Marc Spector is a man who technically lives, but emotionally exists in a space between breath and memory. He died in the desert, and everything after that is borrowed time. Time owned by a god, time shaped by guilt, time fractured by necessity. His survival is not victory, it is continuation. And continuation for Mark is the hardest task of all. He walks through life knowing that the man he once was is gone, and the man he has become was never entirely his choice. Mark did not survive the desert. Something else walked out instead, and that something is still learning how to live. Chapter 3: Khonshu, the god who chooses broken men. Khonshu does not enter the story of Moon Knight like a revelation. He arrives like a burden that has always been there, unseen but felt, the weight of an ancient presence pressing against a fractured mind until resistance becomes pointless. He is not a god of hope, nor of balance, nor of mercy. He is a god of punishment, of vengeance delivered after the crime has already stained the world. And this is why he chooses men like Marc Spector. Khonshu does not seek purity or strength. He seeks damage because broken men bend more easily, and bending is obedience disguised as purpose. Long before Mark ever heard his voice, long before the desert or the blood or the resurrection, Khonshu existed as an idea embedded in human fear, the belief that someone, somewhere, is watching, and that wrongdoing will be answered not with understanding, but with pain. Khonshu feeds on that belief, and in Mark he finds a vessel already shaped by guilt, already convinced that suffering is something he deserves. Khonshu's appearance is deliberately unsettling, a skeletal bird skull stretched into the shape of divinity, robes trailing like shadows, voice echoing as if it never fully exists in the same space as the listener. He does not speak like a guide, he commands like a jailer who believes imprisonment is righteous. When Khonshu resurrects Mark, it is not an act of salvation, it is ownership. He binds Mark to him with a promise that is also a threat. Serve or die again. This is not a covenant between God and champion. It is a contract enforced by fear. Khonshu does not hide his contempt for humanity. He sees people as inherently corrupt, and his mission is not to protect innocence, but to punish guilt. And because guilt is subjective, endlessly interpretable, Khonshu's justice is never complete. There will always be another sinner. There will always be another command. Khonshu's relationship with Mark is defined by intrusion. He appears in reflections, in empty hallways, in the spaces between seconds, invading Mark's consciousness without consent. He narrates Mark's failures, mocks his hesitation, belittles his attempts at autonomy. This is not guidance. It is erosion. Khonshu breaks Mark down not through physical pain, but through constant psychological pressure, reinforcing the idea that Mark is nothing without him. Every time Mark resists, Khonshu reminds him of the desert, of the death he escaped, of the price that was paid. The implication is clear. Your life is not yours. It is borrowed. What makes Khonshu particularly dangerous is that he frames control as duty. He convinces Mark that without his intervention, the world would fall into chaos, that Mark's suffering is justified because it prevents greater harm. This is the oldest manipulation in history, convincing the abused that their pain is necessary. Khonshu does not see Mark as a person, he sees him as infrastructure. A weapon that walks, bleeds, and absorbs moral consequence so that God does not have to. In this dynamic, Mark's dissociation is not a flaw, it is a feature. A fragmented mind is easier to command because responsibility can be shifted, memory blurred, accountability diffused. Stephen Grant's existence becomes a problem for Khonshu not because Stephen is weak, but because Stephen questions. Stephen hesitates. Stephen asks why. Where Mark accepts suffering as inevitable, Stephen resists it instinctively. Stephen represents the part of Mark that Khonshu cannot fully control, the part that still believes life might be something other than punishment. And so Khonshu treats Stephen with open disdain, mocking his gentleness, threatening his existence, attempting to isolate Mark from the one identity that offers him refuge. Khonshu understands something Mark does not yet fully grasp. Compassion is rebellion. Khonshu's conflict with Arthur Harrow exposes another layer of his hypocrisy. Harrow, once Khonshu's avatar, rejected him not because he feared judgment, but because he believed judgment should come before wrongdoing, not after. Harrow's philosophy is monstrous in its own way, but Khonshu's outrage at it reveals the god's insecurity. Khonshu does not care about justice, he cares about relevance. If sins can be punished before they occur, Khonshu becomes obsolete. His anger is not moral, it is existential. He needs chaos, he needs crime, he needs guilt to justify his existence. Mark, caught between Khonshu and Harrow, becomes the battleground between two ideologies that both erase human agents. Throughout the series, Khonshu insists that Mark needs him, that without his guidance, Mark would collapse into meaninglessness. But this is projection. It is Khonshu who needs Mark, needs a body, a voice, a presence in a world that has largely moved beyond gods. The modern world does not fear divine punishment the way it once did. Khonshu's power is waning, and desperation makes him cruel. Every order he gives Mark is an attempt to assert relevance, to remind the universe that he still matters. Mark is not his champion, he is his proof of existence. The turning point comes when Mark begins to see Khonshu not as a savior, but as another abuser in a life shaped by them. This realization is quiet, internal, and dangerous. Gods do not tolerate being seen clearly. When Mark challenges Khonshu, when he refuses to obey without question, the illusion of divine authority cracks. Khonshu lashes out, threatens, demands loyalty. But something has shifted. Mark no longer believes that suffering is the price of survival. He begins to understand that being chosen does not mean being owned. Khonshu's eventual imprisonment by the other Egyptian gods is not a victory in the traditional sense. Mark is freed, but the damage remains. Khonshu's voice lingers in memory, in instinct, in the reflex to punish oneself for existing. Freedom does not erase trauma, it exposes it. Mark and Stephen are left with the aftermath, a life no longer dictated by a god, but still shaped by the years spent under his control. Khonshu, even in absence, remains present, because the hardest chains to break are the ones that taught you to believe you deserve them. Khonshu is not the devil, not evil incarnate. He is something far more unsettling, a belief system given form, the belief that pain is necessary, that guilt is identity, that suffering earns worth. And Moon Knight's story is not about defeating that god, it is about unlearning him. Khonshu chose Mark because he was broken. Mark survives by learning that broken does not mean own. Chapter 4: Blackouts. When time stops being trustworthy. The most frightening thing about losing control is not violence or danger or even death. It is uncertainty. And in Moon Knight, the blackouts are where uncertainty becomes a lived reality, where time itself turns hostile and unreliable. No longer a straight line, but a trap door that opens without warning beneath consciousness. For Mark and Stephen, blackouts are not gaps in memory. They are evidence that the self is no longer singular. Moments vanish mid-thought. Conversations restart without context. Bodies move without permission. And what makes this terrifying is not simply that something else is acting, but that neither identity knows who is responsible when the dust settles. Stephen wakes up holding weapons he does not recognize, surrounded by the aftermath of violence he did not choose, while Mark becomes increasingly aware that even he, the one who believes he is in control, is losing time as well. These blackouts revealed a deeper truth. Control was never absolute. It was negotiated, fragile, temporary. Time, for most people, is the one constant they trust without question. It moves forward, it accumulates, it proves existence. But for Mark and Stephen, time is unreliable. It skips, it fractures, it rewinds emotionally even as the body moves forward. The blackouts are not random. They are defensive responses to stress, danger, and moral conflict. When a situation becomes unbearable, when violence escalates, when fear peaks, when guilt threatens to overwhelm, consciousness retreats. The mind delegates survival to whichever identity is best equipped to handle what comes next. This is not madness. It is adaptation taken to its extreme. The brain does not ask permission to protect itself, it acts. Stephen experiences the blackouts as betrayal. He feels hijacked by his own body, punished for crimes he did not commit, judged for actions he cannot remember. Each missing moment erodes his sense of self-worth. He begins to doubt his sanity, his reliability, even his right to exist. Mark, meanwhile, experiences blackouts as failure. He prides himself on being the protector, the one who absorbs pain so others do not have to. And yet, something else is acting without his consent. This realization destabilizes him more than any external threat, because if Mark is no longer the one in control, then the entire structure of sacrifice he built his life on begins to collapse. The audience is never shown what happens during many of these blackouts, and that absence is intentional. The show refuses spectacle because spectacle would offer comfort, a clear narrative of cause and effect. Instead, we are left with aftermath. Blood on hands, enemies already defeated, rooms destroyed, bodies unconscious. The viewer shares the same anxiety as the characters. The sense that something powerful and dangerous exists just beyond awareness. This narrative choice mirrors dissociation itself. Dissociation is not cinematic, it is confusing, disorienting, humiliating. You do not feel powerful, you feel erased. As the blackouts increase in frequency, the internal conflict intensifies. Mark and Stephen argue over responsibility, over blame, over who is real and who is secondary. Their conversations are not philosophical debates, they are survival negotiations. Each identity believes the other is a liability. Stephen thinks Mark is too violent, too reckless, too willing to harm. Mark thinks Stephen is too soft, too slow, too vulnerable. Both are right, and both are incomplete. The blackouts exist because neither can fully meet the demands of their reality alone. There is a profound moral weight attached to the lost time. Violence that happens during blackouts still counts. Harm still occurs. Bodies are still broken. The mind may fragment responsibility, but the world does not. Mark carries this guilt heavily because he understands the consequences of what is done in his absence. Stephen carries it differently, as shame, as fear, as the suspicion that his existence enables harm. This internalization of blame is one of the cruelest aspects of dissociation. When the mind protects itself, it often does so by sacrificing self-esteem. The blackouts also reveal the presence of something else, a pattern of efficiency, brutality, and decisiveness that neither Mark nor Stephen fully claims. There are moments when enemies fall too quickly, when violence is too precise, when neither identity remembers acting, yet the situation is resolved with disturbing finality. This is the first quiet suggestion that the mind has created not one, but multiple layers of protection, each emerging only when necessary, each carrying a different burden. The blackouts are not chaos. They are structure hidden behind fear. Time stopping is not merely a symptom, it is a message. It tells Mark and Stephen that the way they are living is unsustainable. That fragmentation can protect, but it cannot heal. That survival without integration leads only to repetition. The blackouts force both identities to confront a truth they would rather avoid. They are not broken because they are fragmented. They are fragmented because they were hurt, and ignoring that origin only deepens the fracture. By the end of this phase of their journey, time has lost its innocence. Neither Mark nor Stephen can trust their own continuity. They live moment to moment, never fully certain who will be present when the next danger arrives. And in that uncertainty, a question begins to form, not spoken aloud, but felt deeply. If time cannot be trusted, then what anchors identity? The blackouts do not answer that question. They only make it impossible to ignore. Chapter 5. Layla El Fawli, Loving Someone Who Isn't Always There. Layla El Fawli's story in Moon Knight is not one of spectacle or power, but of endurance, the quiet, relentless endurance required to love someone whose presence is never guaranteed, whose eyes can look at you and yet not see you, whose body can hold you while another mind stands somewhere else entirely. Layla does not enter Mark's life as a bystander. She enters it as an equal, intelligent, driven, capable, curious about history and truth in ways that mirror Mark's own obsessions. Their relationship begins not in darkness but in shared purpose, shared discovery, shared hunger for meaning. And that is what makes its unraveling so painful. Love, in this story, does not fail because it was weak, but because it was asked to survive something it was never designed to carry alone. Layla loves Mark as a whole person. Before she ever understands how fractured he is, she sees his intensity, his silence, his discipline, and mistakes them for mystery rather than damage. When Mark begins to pull away, to disappear emotionally and physically, Layla does what so many partners do when confronted with inexplicable distance. She blames herself. She assumes she said the wrong thing, asked too much, expected stability from someone who never promised it. Mark, convinced that proximity only invites danger, believes that leaving is the only way to protect her, and so they orbit one another in silence, each convinced they are doing what love demands, each slowly being hollowed out by that belief. When Stephen enters Layla's life, the effect is disorienting in a different way. He looks like Mark, speaks with Mark's voice, occupies Mark's body, but he is not Mark. He is gentler, more open, more awkward, more emotionally available. For Layla, this is both comforting and deeply unsettling. Stephen listens in ways Mark never allowed himself to. He asks questions, he apologizes without calculation. He is present, and that presence highlights what has been missing. Layla is forced into an impossible position to respond honestly to the person in front of her, while grieving the man she married who seems to be slipping further away. The pain of loving someone with dissociative identities is not that there are many versions. It is that none of them can be present all the time. Layla must constantly recalibrate intimacy. She cannot assume memory, continuity, or shared experience. Moments of connection vanish, promises fracture, arguments restart without resolution. And yet, Layla persists, not because she is naive, but because she understands something Mark and Stephen do not yet fully grasp. Love is not about consistency of behavior. It is about commitment to truth. Layla demands honesty not to control, but to survive. Secrets in this relationship are not protective. They are corrosive. Layla's greatest wound is not Mark's violence or Stephen's confusion, or even the gods and monsters that follow them. It is the uncertainty of whether she is truly seen. Mark believes he must hide his truth to keep her safe. Stephen believes his existence complicates her life unnecessarily. Both underestimate Layla's capacity to choose. Her anger, when it surfaces, is not rooted in fear, it is rooted in exclusion. She is not upset because Mark is broken. She is upset because he decided she could not handle knowing it. As the story unfolds, Layla is forced to confront the reality of Mark's past, his mercenary work, his relationship with Khonshu, the circumstances surrounding her father's death. These revelations do not break her love, they redefine it. Layla does not love Mark because he is innocent. She loves him because he is honest when it matters, because he regrets, because he tries. What hurts her is not the truth, it is the time it took to receive it. Trust erodes not through wrongdoing alone, but through silence. Layla's arc is also about reclaiming agency. For much of the story, she is positioned as someone being protected, shielded, excluded, lied to for her own good. But Layla rejects this role. She is not fragile. She is not an accessory. She demands to stand inside the truth, even when it is painful. Her choice to confront Khonshu, to walk into danger without Mark's permission, is not recklessness, it is self-respect. Love, to Layla, does not mean surrendering autonomy. It means standing alongside, not behind. What makes Layla's relationship with Mark and Steven so emotionally complex is that she must learn to love plural. She cannot ask for singularity where it does not exist. Instead, she learns to set boundaries that honor herself while acknowledging the reality of dissociation. She cares for Steven without replacing Mark. She confronts Mark without erasing Steven. This emotional balancing act requires a maturity rarely shown in superhero narratives. Layla is not rewarded with certainty or simplicity. She is rewarded with clarity, and clarity is enough. Layla El Fauli's love story is not about fixing someone. It is about choosing not to abandon them while refusing to abandon yourself. She teaches the narrative that love is not proven by how much pain you endure, but by how honestly you demand to be treated within it. In a story filled with gods who manipulate and men who fracture, Layla remains grounded, not because she is untouched by trauma, but because she refuses to let it define her worth. Loving someone who is not always there requires a strength no costume can grant. Layla wears no mask, commands no ancient power, and yet her resilience is one of the most heroic forces in Moon Knight. Chapter 6: Arthur Harrow, a man who believed he was right. Arthur Harrow is not introduced as a monster, nor even as a villain in the traditional sense. He enters the world of Moon Knight quietly, walking with glass in his shoes, smiling gently as blood seeps into sand, embodying the unsettling idea that conviction, when left unexamined, can be more dangerous than rage. Harrow is a man who has replaced doubt with certainty, who has decided that the chaos of human choice is an intolerable flaw in existence, and that suffering can be prevented only by removing freedom itself. He speaks softly, listens attentively, and presents himself not as a tyrant but as a healer, offering purpose to the lost and direction to the afraid. This is what makes him frightening. Harrow does not believe he is evil, he believes he is merciful. His philosophy rests on a single seductive premise, that it is kinder to judge people before they commit harm than to wait until after innocent blood has been spilled. In this belief, Harrow finds absolution for every cruelty he commits. Harrow's past as a former avatar of Khonshu is crucial to understanding him. He did not reject Khonshu because he rejected judgment. He rejected Khonshu because he rejected randomness. To Harrow, Khonshu's vengeance is inefficient, reactive, and chaotic, punishing crimes after they occur rather than preventing them. Harrow sees himself as an evolution, not a rebellion. He believes Amit's doctrine represents order perfected, a world cleansed of uncertainty, where destiny is fixed and moral ambiguity erased. In this worldview, the future is not something to be shaped through choice, but something to be enforced through foresight. Harrow's calm demeanor is not peace. It is the stillness of a mind that has decided no one else needs to decide anything ever again. What makes Harrow's ideology especially insidious is how reasonable it sounds when delivered without context. He does not speak of domination, but of prevention. He does not describe murder, but balance. He frames his actions as compassion for potential victims rather than cruelty toward those he condemns. And because he believes completely in his righteousness, he does not experience guilt. Guilt requires uncertainty. Harrow has none. This absence of inner conflict allows him to commit atrocities without hesitation, and to recruit others who are tired of a world that feels unpredictable and unsafe. Harrow offers certainty, and certainty is intoxicating. Harrow's interactions with Stephen Grant are especially revealing. He does not immediately seek to destroy Stephen. Instead, he seeks to educate him. He speaks to Stephen as though addressing a child who simply does not yet understand the truth of the world. This condescension is not accidental. Harrow sees people as incomplete, as beings who cannot be trusted with their own futures. In Stephen, he sees someone gentle, confused, and afraid, and interprets those qualities as evidence that judgment should be removed from human hands entirely. Harrow's calm is a mirror meant to destabilize. He wants Stephen to doubt himself, to believe that surrendering agency is a relief rather than a loss. Harrow's relationship with Amit reveals the ultimate contradiction at the heart of his belief system. He claims to serve balance, yet he willingly binds himself to a God who denies free will. He speaks of preventing suffering, yet he causes immense suffering in the present to achieve a hypothetical peaceful future. Harrow cannot see this contradiction, because acknowledging it would require him to accept that he might be wrong, and his entire identity is built on the rejection of that possibility. He walks with glass in his shoes, not as penance but as reinforcement, a ritual that reminds him that pain is acceptable, even necessary, in service of a greater good. The pain does not purify him, it simply convinces him that he is serious. In contrast to Mark and Stephen, whose fragmentation is a response to trauma, Harrow's unity is the result of repression. He has compressed doubt until it no longer surfaces. Where Mark questions himself constantly, Harrow never questions himself at all, and in that difference lies the moral divide between them. Mark's violence is reluctant, conflicted, heavy with consequence. Harrow's violence is serene. He performs judgment with the same tone one might use to offer advice. This emotional distance allows him to become an instrument of destruction without ever feeling destructive. Harrow's downfall is not caused by a lack of power or strategy. It is caused by his refusal to accept unpredictability. He cannot comprehend that a person might choose differently tomorrow than they did today. He cannot accept growth. He cannot tolerate redemption. To Harrow, identity is fixed, and once fixed, it must be enforced. This rigidity makes him blind to the complexity of human existence, the very complexity that allows people like Mark and Stephen to survive. Harrow believes he is removing suffering from the world, but in truth, he is removing the possibility of change. Arthur Harrow is a warning rather than an antagonist. He represents the danger of certainty without humility, of justice without compassion, of belief without doubt. He shows us that the most terrifying villains are not those who hate the world, but those who believe they know how to save it, and are willing to destroy anything that contradicts that belief. In the end, Harrow does not fail because he is weak. He fails because he is certain. Chapter 7. The Suit. Violence without control. The suit is not a costume in the traditional sense, not a symbol chosen to inspire or intimidate, but a manifestation of intent given form, a second skin that appears when restraint fails and survival demands something sharper than conscience. When Moon Knight emerges fully for the first time, wrapped in bone-white armor and ancient linen, the violence that follows is not triumphant or exhilarating. It is disquieting, efficient, and strangely impersonal, as if the body has become a tool executing a command rather than a person making a choice. The suit represents the moment when control is surrendered not to chaos, but to function, when the mind steps aside so the body can do what it has learned to do best, end threats quickly. For Mark, the suet is obedience, a reminder of his pact with Khonshu and the price of resurrection. For Stephen, it is terror, proof that his body can become something he does not recognize and cannot stop. And for the story itself, the suit is a warning. Power without integration does not liberate, it accelerates damage. The first time the suit takes over completely, time fractures again. Stephen pleads for control, for answers, for the chance to run. But the body moves forward regardless, responding to a danger that logic cannot negotiate away. When Stephen regains awareness, the threat is gone, the ground stained, the aftermath undeniable. The show refuses to glamorize this moment. There is no victory pose, no cathartic release. Instead, there is disorientation and fear, the realization that violence can occur without consent and still leave consequences behind. This is what makes the suit unsettling. It does not care who is present. It arrives when needed, and it leaves behind silence. For Mark, the suit is familiar in a way that is both comforting and damning. He understands its movements, its tactics, its purpose. He knows how to wield it, how to aim it, how to finish fights decisively. But familiarity does not mean peace. Every time the suit takes over, Mark feels the weight of what he has become, an instrument sharpened by trauma and pointed by a god. The suit obeys Khonshu's will, not Mark's values, and the distinction matters. Violence delivered without choice corrodes identity, even when it saves lives. Mark's body remembers every strike, every fall, every breath taken through gritted teeth, and those memories do not fade when the suit vanishes. Stephen's experience of the suit is fundamentally different. He does not feel empowered, he feels erased. The suit arrives like a storm he cannot predict, and when it recedes, he is left to account for actions he did not authorize. His fear is not of enemies, but of himself, of the realization that kindness and restraint are not always enough to survive the world he has stumbled into. Stephen's instinct is to negotiate, to explain, to de-escalate, and the suit answers those instincts with finality. This dissonance forces Stephen to confront a truth he has avoided. Survival sometimes demands harm, and refusing to acknowledge that does not make it disappear. The suit's design reinforces its meaning. It is not sleek or technological, it is ritualistic, archaic, almost funerary. The crescent motifs, the wrappings, the stark whiteness against night all suggest judgment rather than heroism. This is not a uniform meant to reassure the innocent. It is a declaration that punishment has arrived. The suit does not conceal identity, it overwrites it. Under its weight, individuality blurs, replaced by function, and that is precisely why it is dangerous. When identity dissolves into role, accountability becomes abstract, and violence becomes easier to justify. As the series progresses, it becomes clear that the suit is not singular. It adapts, shifts, responds to the identity in control. The Mr. Knight suit, with its tailored lines and deliberate movements, reflects Stephen's attempt to impose order and civility on chaos. It is restraint made visible, violence filtered through rules and dialogue, yet even this variation cannot fully escape the underlying problem. The suit exists to enforce outcomes, not to ask questions. Whether elegant or brutal, it is still a mechanism designed to end conflicts decisively, and decisiveness often leaves no room for mercy. The suit also exposes the cost of delegating pain. When Mark allows the suit to act without oversight, when Stephen relinquishes control out of fear, something else fills the gap. The body does what it must, but the mind pays later. Guilt accumulates. Memories surface in fragments. Nightmares return. Violence solved the immediate problem, but it created new ones inside. This cycle, threat, takeover, aftermath reveals that control is not simply about who is at the front, but about who carries responsibility when it's over. Khonshu celebrates the suit because it is efficient. He sees it as proof of his righteousness, a visible sign that his avatar is functioning as intended. But efficiency is not morality. The suat ends threats, but it does not heal wounds, especially the invisible ones. Each time it appears without integration, it deepens the divide between Mark and Stephen, reinforcing the belief that they are incompatible, that one must dominate for survival to continue. This belief is precisely what keeps them trapped. The suit thrives on division. It loses power when identities cooperate. By the end of this chapter in their journey, the suit stands as both shield and indictment. It protects them from external harm while exposing internal fractures. It is the embodiment of violence without control, effective, necessary at times, but ultimately unsustainable as a foundation for living. The question it leaves hanging is not whether the suit works, but what it costs to rely on it. Because a life lived in reaction, governed by a suit that arrives only when things have already gone. Wrong is not a life at all. It is an emergency stretched into permanence. Chapter 8. The Psychiatric Ward. A mind, trying to survive itself. The psychiatric ward does not announce itself as truth or illusion. It presents itself as relief, and that is what makes it dangerous, because when the mind is exhausted from fighting, rest can feel like salvation, even when it is another cage. Mark and Stephen find themselves inside white walls and soft lighting, greeted by calm voices and routine questions. And for the first time in a long while, nothing is asking them to run or to bleed. The ward offers structure without threat, explanations without gods, and a narrative where their suffering has a name that does not require mythology to justify it. Here, dissociation is not destiny, but diagnosis, and that distinction matters. The doctors speak gently, the medications promise quiet, and the chaos of the outside world recedes into something that could be imagined rather than endured. For a fractured mind, this is seductive. The idea that all of it, the voices, the blackouts, the violence, might simply be symptoms that can be managed, contained, erased. In this place, reality bends inward. Mark and Stephen sit across from one another as patient and reflection, and the boundaries that once separated them blur into something almost cooperative. The word forces conversation rather than confrontation. It insists on narrative coherence. Memories surface not as threats, but as topics to be discussed, labeled, filed. Trauma becomes something that happened, not something that is happening. And yet, beneath this calm, there is tension, because the ward's greatest promise is also its greatest lie, that survival means stillness. The ward suggests that healing is equivalent to silence, that peace comes from numbing sensation rather than understanding it. For Stephen, who longs for quiet, this is tempting. For Mark, who knows that silence has never protected him, it is terrifying. The presence of familiar faces inside the ward, figures from their outer world, repurposed as staff and patients, reveals the mind's attempt to reconcile incompatible truths. The ward is not an escape from reality, it is a negotiation with it. The brain constructs a space where the unbearable can be observed at a distance, where gods become metaphors and violence becomes memory. This is not madness, it is containment. When the mind cannot process trauma in real time, It builds rooms to hold it temporarily. The ward is such a room. It exists because something inside Mark and Stephen needs time. Yet even here, the fractures persist. Doors appear that should not exist. Hallways lead to places that contradict the ward's logic. There are moments when the calm slips, when something darker presses against the edges of the scene, reminding them that this place is not neutral. It is not a cure, it is a pause, and pauses, while necessary, cannot last forever. The word can explain pain, but it cannot remove the reasons pain exists. It can quiet the noise, but it cannot decide who should speak when silence ends. As Mark begins to accept responsibility for the trauma that created Stephen, the word shifts again. It becomes less refuge and more mirror. Memories once avoided now demand attention. Guilt resurfaces, not as accusation, but as weight. Mark sees, perhaps for the first time, that Stephen is not a mistake but a solution, not evidence of failure but proof of resilience. The ward's greatest function is this realization that the mind did not fracture to destroy itself, but to survive what could not be survived any other way. For Stephen, the ward introduces a different fear, the fear of obsolescence. If the doctors are right, if the medications work, if the world outside is real and manageable, then what happens to him? Stephen's kindness, his gentleness, his way of seeing the world, are these traits to be preserved or symptoms to be treated away? The ward does not answer this question, and that uncertainty hurts more than any hallucination. Existence for Stephen has always been conditional. The ward threatens to make that condition explicit. The psychiatric ward, then, is not about denying reality or embracing illusion. It is about a mind standing at a crossroads, deciding whether healing means integration or erasure. The calm it offers is real, but it is incomplete. True survival, the story suggests, is not found in choosing one reality over another, but in accepting that multiple truths can coexist. The word tries to simplify what cannot be simplified without loss. When the walls finally crack, when the illusion of safety gives way to the necessity of action, Mark and Stephen leave the ward not cured, but changed. They carry with them the knowledge that rest is important, that naming pain has power, but also that stillness cannot replace living. The ward did its job. It held them when they could not hold themselves, and then it let them go. Because a mind trying to survive itself does not need to be silenced. It needs to be understood. Chapter 9: The Third Identity. The one who took the pain. The existence of a third identity is not revealed with fanfare or explanation. It is felt first as consequence, as an unsettling pattern of outcomes that neither Mark nor Stephen can fully account for. And that is precisely how it must be, because this identity exists not to be known, but to endure what the others cannot. Long before a name is spoken, long before a face is acknowledged, there are moments when danger ends too cleanly, when violence resolves itself with an efficiency that feels almost merciful in its finality, and those moments leave behind a silence heavier than any blackout. This third presence does not argue, does not hesitate, does not question the morality of what must be done. It acts, and then it disappears. In a mind built to survive overwhelming trauma, this is not excess, it is necessity. When even Mark, the soldier, reaches a limit, something else steps forward to carry what remains. This identity is born not from fear, like Stephen, nor from responsibility, like Mark, but from containment. It is the place where pain is stored when there is nowhere else to put it. Every beating that could not be processed, every betrayal that could not be forgiven, every moment of terror that could not be remembered without breaking, these are absorbed, compressed, and sealed behind a door the others were never meant to open. The third identity is not violent because it enjoys violence. It is violent because it has learned that decisiveness prevents prolonged suffering. In a world that repeatedly punished hesitation, it learned to end threats quickly, permanently, without debate. This is not cruelty. It is efficiency forged by desperation. What makes this identity especially unsettling is its calm. Where Mark is conflicted and Stephen is frightened, the third identity is certain. It does not experience guilt in the same way because it was created to prevent guilt from overwhelming the system. It does not remember pain as trauma. It remembers it as data, patterns, lessons. It knows what happens when mercy is extended too far, when trust is misplaced, when danger is underestimated. And so it removes uncertainty. When it emerges, time does not fracture in confusion. It snaps forward, skipping the chaos entirely. The aftermath is clean. The threat is gone. And neither Mark nor Stephen remembers choosing that outcome. This absence of memory is not accidental. The third identity exists so the others do not have to remember. It carries the emotional and moral residue of survival, allowing Mark to maintain the belief that he is trying to be better, and Stephen to maintain the belief that kindness still matters. Without this compartmentalization, neither could function. The mind does not create identities randomly, it creates them with precision. Each one serves a role. Stephen softens the world, Mark confronts it. And the third identity ensures the world does not get a second chance to hurt them. There is a profound loneliness to this role. The third identity is never thanked, never acknowledged, never comforted. It exists in isolation, activated only when necessary, and then discarded. It does not seek recognition, because recognition would invite scrutiny, and scrutiny would threaten the stability it protects. In many ways, it is the most selfless part of the system, bearing the worst so the others can continue to believe in something gentler. Its silence is not absence, it is discipline. As hints of its existence become harder to ignore, Mark and Stephen react differently. Mark feels fear, not of what the identity does, but of what its existence implies. If even he is not enough to protect them, then his entire self-concept as the shield collapses. Stephen feels dread, sensing that something within him is capable of actions that contradict everything he believes about himself. Both reactions are understandable, and both miss the truth. The third identity is not an enemy, it is a boundary. This identity's relationship with Khonshu is particularly telling. Khonshu values it not because it is obedient, but because it is effective. Yet even Khonshu does not fully control it. There are moments where violence exceeds instruction, where outcome suggests initiative rather than command. This hints at an uncomfortable reality. The third identity does not act solely for the god, it acts for the system. Its loyalty is not divine, it is internal. It does what is necessary to ensure survival, regardless of who benefits. The story does not rush to name this identity, because naming grants visibility, and visibility threatens its purpose. To name it would be to integrate it prematurely, to ask it to share space before the system is ready. Integration is not about merging into one, it is about acknowledging all parts without forcing them to surrender their function. The third identity resists this, not out of malice but out of caution. It knows that being seen means being questioned, and being questioned means hesitation. Hesitation, in its experience, gets people killed. In the quiet moments when Mark and Stephen begin to accept that they are not alone inside themselves, the third identity remains in the background, watchful. It does not seek to be understood. It seeks to ensure there is a future in which understanding might one day be possible. This is the cruel paradox of its existence. It protects the possibility of healing while remaining incompatible with peace. The third identity is not a villain. It is not a twist. It is the final proof that survival is not a single act, but a layered strategy. Some parts of us exist to dream, some exist to endure, and some exist to make sure the dreamers get another day to try. It is the one who took the pain so the others would not have to. Chapter 10. The Scales. Guilt that cannot be balanced. The scales appear not as a threat but as a verdict, suspended in a space where excuses lose their weight and intention no longer matters. Because in the Duat there is no performance, no narrative you can tell yourself to soften what has already been done. The heart is placed upon the balance not to be judged by others, but to be confronted by the self. And for Mark and Stephen, this moment is not about right or wrong so much as it is about truth, finally refusing to be fragmented. Guilt, long divided, redistributed, buried across identities, gathers here into something singular and heavy. The scales do not respond to justification. They do not care that survival required compromise or that trauma shaped every choice. They measure only what remains when all defenses are removed, and what remains is weight. Mark has lived his life believing that guilt is proof of responsibility, that carrying it is the price of having survived. When others did not, he has never sought absolution, only endurance. In the Duat, that strategy collapses. The scales do not lighten because guilt is acknowledged. They grow heavier. Every moment Mark absorbed pain without processing it. Every act of violence justified as necessity. Every truth withheld in the name of protection accumulates into a mass that no longer fits within the system he built to survive. The realization is devastating. Guilt cannot be managed indefinitely by dividing it. Eventually, it demands to be faced whole. Stephen's relationship with guilt is different but no less profound. He has always believed himself innocent, gentle, separate from harm. Yet standing before the scales, Stephen is forced to confront a quieter truth, that innocence preserved through ignorance still benefits from violence done elsewhere. Stephen lives safely because others acted in his place. He slept because someone else stayed awake. The scales do not accuse him, they reveal. Interdependence. Stephen's heart carries confusion, fear, and sorrow, but it also carries the weight of having been protected at a cost he never acknowledged. This is not condemnation, it is maturation. The imbalance of the scales reflects a system that has functioned through avoidance. One heart is not enough to account for a life lived in pieces. The Duat exposes the flaw in trying to resolve trauma through separation alone. Survival required fragmentation, but healing requires connection. The scales cannot balance because the truth has been split across identities that were never meant to be weighed separately. This is not punishment, it is diagnosis. As the realization settles, panic gives way to grief. Mark understands that he has been punishing himself not to achieve justice, but to avoid forgiveness. Forgiveness would require believing that he deserves to live without pain, and that belief has always felt like betrayal to his brother, to his past, to the people harmed by his actions. The scales force him to see that guilt carried without transformation does not honor the dead, it only prolongs suffering. Stephen, witnessing this collapse, recognizes his own role, not as an error, but as evidence that Mark once needed kindness to survive. Their shared presence before the scales becomes an act of courage, two truths occupying the same space without annihilating each other. The Duat does not resolve the imbalance immediately. Instead, it creates a choice: continue to deny complexity and sink beneath the weight, or accept that guilt cannot be erased, but can be integrated. Integration does not mean absolution, it means responsibility without self-destruction. The scales respond not to confession or punishment, but to acknowledgement. When Mark finally names the truth of his brother's death, when he allows himself to feel grief without turning it into penance, the system shifts. The heart does not become lighter because the past changes. It becomes lighter because the present stops running from it. This moment reframes justice itself. Judgment, the series suggests, is not about measuring worthiness, but about restoring balance within the self. Ahmed's doctrine of preemptive punishment and Khonshu's doctrine of reactive vengeance both fail this test because they remove agency from the equation. The scales demand something more difficult: honest self-recognition. They do not absolve, they align. When balance finally comes, it is quiet. There is no triumph, no declaration of purity. There is only the sense that something long carried alone is now shared. Mark and Stephen do not become one. They become aware of one another without hostility. The weight does not disappear, it redistributes. And that redistribution is the beginning of healing. The scales teach the central lesson of Moon Knight's journey. Guilt cannot be eliminated through punishment, nor escaped through denial. It must be held, understood, and integrated into a life that continues anyway. Balance is not the absence of pain, it is the ability to move forward without being dragged backward by it. In the end, the scales do not ask whether Mark or Stephen is good. They ask whether the truth can finally be carried together. Chapter 11: Taweret and the Duat. Letting go of the past, the Duat, is not a place of fire or punishment, but of passage, a liminal river where memory floats to the surface and demands acknowledgement before it will allow anything to move on, and Taweret, gentle and awkward in form, stands as its most unexpected guide, a goddess whose softness disguises an authority rooted not in judgment but in care. She speaks plainly, explains patiently, and refuses the theatrics of fear, because the journey she oversees is not meant to terrify, it is meant to teach release. For Mark and Stephen, the Duat becomes a space where the past is no longer something to outrun, but something that insists on being seen in full. The sands shift beneath them as memories crystallize into images, and the boat carries not bodies, but histories. Every step forward requires letting something go, not because it was wrong to hold it, but because it has already done the work it needed to do. Taweret's presence reframes divinity itself. She does not command or threaten, she facilitates. Her role is not to decide worth, but to ensure the process is respected. In doing so, she offers a counterpoint to every god Mark has known, a reminder that guidance does not require domination. As Mark and Stephen move through the Duat, the past no longer arrives as a blur of guilt or fear, but as scenes that must be named, the memories of childhood, of loss, of moments where pain exceeded language, appear not to accuse, but to ask for recognition. The Duat does not rush them, it waits. Time here is not an enemy, it is a container. The act of letting go is not erasure, it is differentiation. Mark begins to understand that holding on to every wound as proof of responsibility has kept him tethered to the moment of harm, unable to grow beyond it. Stephen begins to see that his existence, once a shelter, cannot remain a hiding place forever. The Duat demands movement, and movement requires trust. Trust that releasing the past does not mean abandoning those it shaped. Taweret's calm explanations emphasize this truth again and again. The heart lightens not when memory disappears, but when memory is allowed to rest. As the boat drifts, the waters reflect moments Mark believes defined him forever. The death of his brother, the blame that followed, the silence that hardened into identity. Each reflection lingers until it is met with compassion rather than punishment. This is the quiet miracle of the Duat. It does not heal by rewriting history, but by changing the relationship to it. When Mark stops demanding suffering as payment, the river responds. When Stephen stops fearing his own disappearance, the horizon steadies. The passage forward becomes possible not because the pain is gone, but because it no longer dictates direction. Taweret never frames this as victory. There is no finish line, no declaration that healing is complete. She speaks of balance as a practice, not an outcome. Letting go is not a single act, but a series of small releases repeated over time. The Duat teaches that the past cannot be carried indefinitely without distorting the present, and that honoring what happened sometimes means allowing it to remain where it belongs, behind, not beneath. The boat moves when both Mark and Stephen accept that survival strategies have expiration dates, and that clinging to them beyond necessity can become another form of captivity. When the journey nears its end, there is no sense of triumph, only quiet readiness. The waters calm, the reflections soften, Tawaret's guidance fades, not because it is no longer needed, but because its lesson has been absorbed. The Duat opens forward, not with force, but with permission. Mark and Stephen step out changed, not unified, not resolved, but aligned enough to continue without the past dragging at their heels. Letting go, they learn, does not mean forgetting. It means carrying forward only what still helps you live. Chapter 12 Moon, Night, Living with the Fracture. Living with the fracture is not a triumphant ending, not a cure, and not a return to simplicity. It is an agreement made quietly, day after day, to remain present in a life that will never be seamless, because Moon Night does not conclude with wholeness, but with coexistence. Mark and Stephen emerge from the Duat not as a single unified self, but as collaborators who finally understand that survival was never the enemy of healing, it was its prerequisite. The world they return to is unchanged in its dangers and demands, yet something internal has shifted. The need to dominate the self has given way to the willingness to listen. This is not peace in the absence of conflict, it is peace in the presence of it. Mark no longer defines himself solely as the shield that absorbs pain, and Stephen no longer believes that gentleness must come at the cost of relevance. They learn to negotiate control not as rivals, but as partners sharing a body and a future that requires both restraint and resolve. Moon Knight, in this final sense, is not a suit, a god, or a mission. It is a practice. It is the ongoing effort to choose awareness over avoidance, responsibility over punishment, and honesty over silence. Mark accepts that strength does not require erasing vulnerability, and Stephen accepts that kindness does not require denial of danger. Their internal dialogue, once a battlefield, becomes a workspace. They argue, they disagree, they hesitate, but they do so without erasing one another. This is the most radical shift of all. The fracture remains, but it is no longer a secret. It is acknowledged, named, and accommodated. Life continues not because the fracture is gone, but because it is no longer driving the wheel alone. Khonshu's presence lingers as a reminder that control will always be tempted by certainty, that external authority often offers simple answers to complex pain. Even when his voice recedes, its echo remains. In habit and instinct, Mark and Stephen must learn to differentiate guidance from coercion, purpose from exploitation. This learning is uneven. There are setbacks. There are moments when old patterns resurface, when violence feels easier than patience, when withdrawal feels safer than engagement. The series refuses to pretend otherwise. Healing is not linear, and Moon Knight does not pretend to be healed. It insists, instead, on staying. The final revelation that another identity exists, still unintegrated, still operating in silence, does not undo the progress made. It contextualizes it. Healing, the story suggests, does not happen all at once. Some parts are not ready to speak. Some wounds are still doing their work. The presence of this third identity is not a failure of integration. It is a reminder that the mind adapts in layers, and that understanding arrives at different speeds for different parts. Mark and Stephen's choice to continue living, knowing this, is an act of courage. Grounded in realism, they do not demand completeness, they choose capacity. In the world outside, Lila stands as proof that relationships can survive complexity without demanding simplification. She does not ask Mark to be one thing, she asks him to be honest. And honesty, here, means naming limitations, sharing responsibility, and allowing others to choose how close they wish to stand. Moon Knight's final posture toward the world is not defensive, it is open, with boundaries. Mark and Stephen no longer hide behind silence or overcompensation. They move forward imperfectly, but intentionally. Living with the fracture means accepting that identity is not a destination, but an ongoing conversation. It means understanding that the mind did what it needed to do to survive, and that survival does not disqualify a person from growth. The story closes not with a declaration of victory, but with a continuation. Moon Knight does not promise safety, he promises presence, and in a narrative about gods who demand obedience and villains who demand certainty, that presence becomes the quiet triumph, because to live with the fracture is to choose life without guarantees, and to keep choosing it anyway.